Good evening. Thank you for coming. Good day, this. Always a good day, I think. Can you hear me okay? Coming through? September 17th. And at my age or Ben Franklin's age, any day's a good day. I'm 6 feet under, right? What I wanted to do today, and of course we'll have, I hope, plenty of opportunity for conversation unless I misjudge the time, is to talk a little bit about something slightly different than we normally do on these days, Constitution Day. Previous speakers, all of whom are, of course, men and women of quality, have tended to emphasize the architecture of the Constitution. Hi, Barbara, how are you? And the separation of powers, federalism, and so forth, rather specifically, which is, of course, entirely a good thing to do. Most of them, of course, also connected that to the Constitution's purpose. So they talked about the Constitution as the silver frame around the apple of gold, and it's entirely appropriate. I'm going to do something a little different today, partly to prick our imaginations on a different path, but directly related, I think, to the Constitution and to constitutionalism in general, and to citizenship within a regime of self-government specifically. So, famously, you know the story that on this day, the convention signed off on the Constitution and sent it out to the states for ratification, meaning the states would have to vote on delegates going to a convention in each state, and each delegate would be chosen on the basis of whether they're for or against the Constitution. And as they were coming out of the convention, which had been meeting in secret, and I mentioned in passing, had done an illegal thing by drafting the second Constitution of the United States rather than redrafting the articles which they were assigned to do, as they were leaving the convention hall, Ben Franklin comes into the picture publicly, more publicly than perhaps heretofore. The source for this anecdote is a letter which is published in Ferrand's Records of the Federal Convention, Volume 3. And since we never look at the actual source of this, even though we all know the story, it's very brief, so I'll just read it. It's 2 lines. Coming out of the convention, a lady asked Dr. Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have you got, a republic or a monarchy?" And the doctor replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Okay, the lady in question was Mrs. Powell of Philadelphia. How would we think Ben Franklin would want to keep the republic? What would he advise us to do? And of course, the interesting answer to that is he has already advised us, and I think we have forgotten that advice. Which then leads me to a sub-point. We flatter ourselves in thinking that we do good things by reading original texts and documents, and I think that we absolutely do, by the way. This may be the best example of why we should. In working on Franklin for the past few months, I've had the opportunity of reading historians on Franklin. And let me tell you, I mean, they have their amusing moments, and some of them tell a better story than others, and there are plenty of stories with regard to Franklin, most of which I can't go into in mixed company. There are books written just on those stories. The truth is that almost all historians both misunderstand Benjamin Franklin and or misrepresent him. Now this goes way back, and this is nothing new. The Marxists have always disliked him, and anybody on the left actually dislikes Franklin because he's not a man on the left. That's obvious. He's a man who talks about work and energy, enterprise, markets, freedom, capitalism, creating wealth, and so on. Historians call him Marxist or otherwise. They don't have to be Marxist. Just ordinary historians who are banal, if not vicious. You know, call him an elitist, weirdly. a lover of wealth, a man who was unsure of his loyalties. Because after all, Franklin spent almost half his life abroad, and his life was long, right? They say that he's a man who continually contradicts himself, that he doesn't have a political philosophy, that he writes only in particulars and stories, that he's not especially intelligent or thoughtful. He even contradicts himself. Well, the truth of the matter, all that is wrong as soon as you look at Franklin's works itself. And of course, the major work that we used to look at, even in high school, is his autobiography, which apparently we no longer do, with the exception of Barbara's high school. Now, we think of Franklin in other respects, and we hold him in good regard. For example, I mean, this guy was a scientist, often referred to as a philosopher, and that period it gets a little confusing. He was a scientist, and who's a so-called philosopher. He invented the Pennsylvania stove, which is now called the Franklin stove. He invented public libraries, the University of Pennsylvania, clean streets, fire departments. Every tall building in the world has one of Franklin's inventions on top of it. What is that? Lightning rod. Isn't that something? He refused to patent his inventions, by the way, because he thought the inventions were in the public domain and for the public good. And that's what he was doing. Very interesting. And all his scientific work, by the way, is studied by serious people, and there are all kinds of very interesting books and reports on that that's very much worth reading. But of course, I'm not going to talk about that. It's also true, and I just mentioned this in passing, and others in the audience can reflect more on this and know more than I do, he is probably the greatest diplomat we've ever had. Right? I mean, see, that's weird. It merits serious study. Again, I just mentioned it in passing. He went to France, got the French to come into alliance with the new country. One. Two, he got the French to fund over and over and over again. And while he was doing this, with supposedly John Adams' help, he could have done better if John Adams went there. Because Franklin, unlike Adams, was smarter, more charming, knew the French interests better than the French themselves did. And some historians actually maintain that he is responsible for the French Revolution. Because of him and his work on behalf of the United States, the French government went bankrupt. Very interesting. I just mentioned that in passing. He made so much money at a young age. You sort of know the history of that, publishing newspapers and so forth and so on, Poor Richard's Almanac, and very interesting things, which I'm going to only mention in passing, that at age 42 he retired. He retired, and he said he became a gentleman, which meant that he was a master, and I'm quoting him, a master of my own time. And of course, aristocrats, men who never work, are masters of their own time, and that's why they're called themselves gentlemen. But this is a different case. We're now talking about American things, where people have to work or they die, and they encourage one another to work. And the purpose of that work and that accumulation of wealth and capital is to have leisure time. The word leisure means school, and Ben Franklin went to school. In other words, he's a self-taught man. After age 42, when he retired, he said, "The public laid hold of me for their purposes." Nice phrase. So he was involved in public life one way or another after 42 till he died in 1790 at age 70. Now, there's one statement that is only slightly relevant to the topic at hand, that he said early, just 10 years after he retired, he said that life was like a dramatic piece. Life is like a dramatic piece. And he said, I intend to finish it handsomely. What he did throughout his whole life is thought very seriously about what this new regime, this Novus Ordo Seclorum is. And what did this liberty and equality demand from citizens in order to last more than a generation, if you can keep it. This is an imaginative guy, an artful guy, very funny, ironic, witty, charming, very charming, not just with the ladies. He was a teacher of himself and others, and he instructed others as what we do, and I think in our little republics in our classrooms here, we instruct ourselves. He instructed others as he instructed himself, in other words, and as he tried to be instructed by others. And he reflects on this very explicitly in all his writing, especially the autobiography. The instruction that he's after is something having to do with the American mind and the American character. This is something new in the world, and he means to participate in it fully. He chose this country from his point of view, even though he was born here. He actually chose it. He could have stayed in England, which he liked for a long time. He could have stayed in France, which he loved for a long time. And he didn't. He came back and became a full participant in Republican politics. This is the man who invented the American dream. Really, I mean, no small thing. This is the man who went from rags to riches and talked about it and instructed others on how to do it. He explained to us that the way to wealth is industry and frugality, and because of that, you are led to virtue, if you understand it correctly. A little bit more on that in a minute. He went from impotence to importance, from dependence to independence. He is the archetype of the man who makes himself, what we, since Lincoln came to call the log cabin. He takes full responsibility for what he has created, and he thinks everyone else ought to do the same. And he thinks furthermore that any man of what he calls tolerable abilities, this is where I come in, any man of tolerable abilities can do the same in this country. That you don't have to be a genius or have some specific excellence to make yourself. He was, of course, the most well-known, literally is the case, the most well-known man of the era, both nationally and internationally. In Europe, there wasn't anyone who didn't know Franklin. I mean, the historians have written books on that. It's really fascinating. He was involved in that kind of marketing of himself, by the way, which shouldn't surprise us. A very smart guy. There's a very good chance, by the way, in reading him again, as opposed to historians, that in my opinion is a very good chance, and I'm aware of some of the people in the audience are Jefferson fans and Madison fans and Hamilton fans and so forth. A very good chance that when Ben Franklin was in the room that he was the smartest guy in there. And I believe that they know that. And boy, John Adams is a perfect example. He doesn't like it one little bit. Because not only is the guy smart and wise and prudent, but everybody likes him. And nobody, says John, likes me. He became famous in Europe, not just England. The English came to really dislike him. But on the continent, he became famous as the archetypal American man. And he took advantage of that and played it to the hilt. When he went back to France, he went back dressed as an American, which means just somehow more primitive, more rustic, beaver hat, slightly tipping over his head, no wig, or a very cheap wig that revealed to others who saw him that he didn't care for these sorts of appearances. He was, of course, the oldest man at the Constitutional Convention. Following him was Washington. So he had, of all the founders, the most experience in life. And he claimed to say something about how to live well as a free man how to be happy. And if you don't follow his advice, he implied in Poor Richard's Almanac that you will die. What you will do, he says, is what 9 men out of 10 do. Now listen to this. This is really pregnant with meaning. 9 out of 10 human beings, Ben Franklin says, commit suicide. Think about that. He means they don't know how to live because, philosophy, it said for Socrates, was learning how to die. Ben Franklin explicitly says, you live as though you're going to live forever. And if you don't do that, if you become corrupt and lazy and banal and a boredom to yourself and of course your community, then you are committing suicide. This is the man who invented the American citizen, single-handedly. The free man, the rugged individualist, not the Jeffersonian farmer. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a man in a city, maybe even New York, I don't know. Okay, a better city. How can you live as a good, free, virtuous human being in an urban environment? Franklin tells us how. He admits that there are certain virtues that all farmers have by nature, partly because they're private, reluctant to talk, reluctant to participate in public life. They seem self-sufficient. They are also unlearned, Franklin says. Selfish, wrongly understood, and don't care for the civic virtues necessary for free government. He wants his citizens to be self-reliant. They have to be self-reliant. It's not a matter of his need or what Franklin desires. A citizen in this republic has to be self-reliant, hard-working, and he has to know how to advance himself at all times. He explains what kind of foreigners are welcome here. I especially like this short passage, so I'll read it. This is from an essay called Information to Those Who Would Remove to America. Franklin says, I just break into these ideas prevailing more or less in all of the United States. It cannot be worth any man's while who has a means of living at home to expatriate himself in hopes of obtaining a profitable civil office in America. And as to military offices, they are at an end, and with the war, the army is being disbanded. Much less, he says, is it advisable for a person to go thither who has no other quality to recommend him but his birth. In other words, if you have no other quality to recommend you but your birth, if you're an aristocrat, stay away. He continues, in Europe, it has birth. It has indeed its value, but it is a commodity that cannot be carried to a worse market than to that of America, where people do not inquire concerning a stranger, what is he? But what can he do? If he has any useful art, he is welcome. And if he exercises it and behaves well, he will be respected by all that know him. But a mere man of quality, who on that account wants to live upon the public by some office or salary, will be despised and disregarded. Franklin writes much about the necessary conditions of freedom and how to take advantage of it for your own health and happiness. He means health in both ways, physical and spiritual. The autobiography is written for that purpose. He wrote it over the career of his own life in parts, and he did it not only to, I'll get to that in more detail in a minute, not only to give him the pleasure of recollecting things about his life, which he would in no way ever change, he says, by the way. He would not, if he had his life to relive, he'd change nothing. So the autobiography it's almost biblical in its proportions into what it tries to do to the reader and for the reader. He tries to explain the virtues necessary for self-government, the moderation and civility that are necessary, and also a certain kind of benevolence, he calls it. Because, for example, he allowed that he himself maintained a few faults within himself just to keep his friends in countenance. That's what I do. Right? That's the only reason I have any fault, is to make sure that my friends know that I'm imperfect, and so they don't think that I'm better than they are. You're laughing, of course you shouldn't. Franklin apparently meant it. Everything that he does in his life, from his point of view, is towards this end. So he establishes, I know some of you just established a club on campus that's similar. He establishes a club for the improvement of its members, the junto. Right? Why it's called that is an odd sort of story. It's almost a verbal accident. But it's really a club for mutual improvement, and it's a reading club. They read, they talk about the issues of the day. They read, for example, Xenophon's Memorabilia, Socrates, and then the next meeting they talked about how to clean roads. He claimed that what is useful for Republican happiness is what he called the morality of truth, sincerity, and integrity. He pontificated on this at great length in various places, that metaphysical reasonings are dangerous, he said. They're dangerous. It's not that he didn't understand the nature of natural rights and so forth, but he didn't overuse it, as, for example, Jefferson arguably did. And if you don't know what metaphysical reasoning might be at its worst, then I bring you yesterday's New York Times on the Russian shooting. Anybody see this? Oh my, you can't miss stuff like this. Yeah, good, no? So here it is, it's 5 lines long. It's by Andrew Kramer. Russia, shooting and philosophical clash. And I'll read you the story with no comment. An argument over the teachings of the philosopher Immanuel Kant between 2 men standing in line for beer at an outdoor festival in southern Russia. It's actually true, that's why it's so funny. It's perfect. Let me do that again, I can't help it, it's too damn funny. An argument over the teachings of the philosopher Immanuel Kant between 2 men standing in line for beer at an outdoor festival in southern Russia ended when one man shot the other in the head with a gun loaded with rubber bullets, fortunately. The state RIA news agency reported on Monday, citing the police. Though the wound was not critical, the attacker faces up to a decade in prison if convicted on assault charges. Last sentence of this news story, Among educated Russians, including those who drink, which means it's a repetition because all educated Russians. Among educated Russians, including those who drink, classical literature and philosophy are sometimes debated in casual social settings, the way sports often are in Western culture. Now, interesting, no? I mean, so the guy who got shot was the guy who believed in the categorical imperative. Moron. That's not the way Franklin thinks conversation should, never mind the shooting, the vehemence of the conversation between citizens about important things should look like. Let me read you the first paragraph, a little shorter than the first paragraph, really, of the autobiography, just to give you a flavor. It's maybe 12 lines. I'm starting 10 lines into it. It's addressed to his son, by the way. The first part of the 4 parts is addressed to his son. The third part no longer is addressed to his son, because by then his son had made clear that he prefers to be a British subject and an American citizen. So from Franklin's point of view, his son became a traitor, and so he disowned him. Having emerged from, this is Franklin, having emerged from poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred, to a state of affluence and some degree of reputation in the world, and having gone so far through life with a considerable share of felicity, the conducting means I made use of, which, with the blessings of God, so well succeeded, my posterity may like to know, as they may find some of them suitable to their own situations and therefore fit to be imitated. That felicity, when I reflect on it, has induced me sometimes to say that were it offered to my choice, I should have no objection to a repetition of the same life from its beginning. Only taken advantage authors have in a second edition to correct some faults of the first. It's funny. Not to you. So would I, if I might, besides correcting the faults, change some sinister accidents and events of it for others more favorable. But though this were denied, I should still accept the offer. However, since such a repetition is not to be expected, the thing most like living one's life over again seems to be a recollection of that life. Isn't that something? And to make that recollection as durable as possible, for putting it down in writing. He, of course, establishes famously, which I'm sure you know much about as I do, his 13 virtues, right? You know something about this? And he introduces it. This is on page 66. This is a very good edition I found, by the way. This is the Norton Critical edition of the autobiography and some other writings. He introduces the 13 virtues, which I'll get to in a minute, like this. It was about this time that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wish to live without committing any fault at any time. I would conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. As I knew, or thought I knew, what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. But I soon found I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. While my care was employed in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took the advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason. I concluded at length that the mere speculative conviction that it was our interest to be completely virtuous was not sufficient to prevent our slipping, and that the contrary habits must be broken and good ones acquired and established before we can have any dependence on a steady, uniform rectitude of conduct. For this purpose, I therefore contrived the following method, and that he describes it in his 13 virtues. And I'll read some of them just in passing and focus on a few if we have time. So the first one he lists is temperance, and he kind of briefly defines each. Temperance. Are you laughing at me because I'm talking about temperance? Yeah, good, because he doesn't really mean it either. Temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Frugality, this is 4. Resolve to perform, I'll read all the virtues and then I want to define all. Temperance, silence, order, resolution, which he defines as resolve to perform what you ought, Perform without fail what you resolve. 5 is frugality. Make no expense but to do good to others or yourself, i.e., waste nothing. That's frugality. Industry. Number 6 is industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. That's really quite remarkable. He actually tried most of these things, and of course he was able to do most of them reasonably well. He can't do them perfectly, which of course he came to realize. He understood that, I should say, probably from the beginning, but he makes the reader realize not to expect perfection, because you're talking about human nature, not angels, right? That's part of the charm of it. So there's one story that I don't know how old he was, 55 or something like that, and he decided that he ought to learn a few languages. So he learned, let's see, I'm not sure the order exactly, he learned French, Spanish, Italian, and then he bumped into someone who knew Latin, and he realized when the person was reading some Latin that he almost understood it, so he decided to go ahead and study Latin. And he had a chess partner who often wanted to play chess with him, and he was much better in Latin than Franklin, so he said, let's play chess, and then we'll just do everything in Latin. And Franklin, just as an example of this virtue of industry and cutting off all unnecessary action, he decided that it would take much too long to play chess in Latin, and that he'd rather be reading. So he didn't do it with the gentleman who asked him. Just made a calculation. So 3 hours spent playing chess and learning Latin, or 3 hours spent reading something. Number 6 is industry. Lose no time. First sentence. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. 7 is sincerity. I like this one very much. It's very ambiguous. Well, the first sentence is use no hurtful deceit. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly, and if you speak, speak accordingly, innocently and justly, and don't use hurtful deceit, which means you can use deceit on certain occasions as long as it's not hurtful. White lies. 8 is justice. Wrong none by doing injuries or committing the benefits that are your duty. 9, moderation. Avoid extremes. Forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. 10, cleanliness. Cleanliness. You think it's silly. It's not silly. Cleanliness. I mean, we're talking about, early 18th century. Right? Tolerate no uncleanness in body, clothes, or habitation. Just remind you in passing that when Booker Washington wanted to go to school and tromped his way from 500 miles from West Virginia to Southern Virginia to go to this school that he'd heard about, Hampton Institute, you know what happened, right? In terms of this was a school for blacks, for freed blacks, run by a white former officer, missionary. And he arrives at the school and he's given a test. He wants to get in. And he's given a test. You don't know the story. No one seems to know the story anymore. And the woman who runs the place, black woman, gives him, takes him into a room and gives him a cloth and says, clean it. He cleaned it 3 or 4 times. And he would have done it more if he had more time. And she came back in, checked everything, and it was clean enough. So he was allowed into the school. We have thought of doing such things. The problem is that, I think 10% of you would end up being here. It's no longer the kind of virtue that we think about. Although Segenga likes to point out in his class is that the Swiss still have it as a requirement for citizenship. Right? Isn't that strange? that there's actually a cleanliness police and so on in Switzerland. And if you're not clean, you can't be a citizen. Anyway, it's an interesting point you can think about later. Number 11 is tranquility. Be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unavoidable. Number 12, this is especially chastity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring. Never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. Very interesting and the complex rewriting of a Christian ethic. The 13th is, by the way, the 13th was an addition. He explained, I think I may have noted it. Let me see, did I? Maybe. It's in this one. Let's see. Here it is. The 13th is humility. It becomes very important in his characterization of citizenship and so forth. My list of virtues, he says in the autobiography, contained at first but 12. But a Quaker friend, having kindly informed me that I was generally thought proud, that my pride showed itself frequently in conversation, that I was not content with being in the right when discussing any point, but was overbearing and rather insolent, of which he convinced me by mentioning several instances, I determined endeavoring to cure myself, if I could, of this vice or folly among the rest, and I added humility to my list, giving an extensive meaning to the word. I cannot boast of much success in acquiring the reality of this virtue, but I had a good deal with regard to the appearance of it. I made it a rule to forbear all direct contradiction to the sentiments of others. He actually means this, and he did it. He's not notorious, good at it. And all positive assertion of my own. Forbear. I even forbid myself, agreeable to the old laws of our junto club, the use of every word or expression in the language that imported a fixed opinion, such as certainly, undoubtedly, etc. And I adopted instead of them, I conceive, I apprehend, or I imagine a thing to be so or so, or it so appears to me at present. When another asserted something that I thought an error, I denied myself the pleasure of contradicting him abruptly and of showing immediately some absurdity in his proposition. He denied himself that pleasure. And in answering, I began observing that in certain cases or circumstances his opinion would be right, but that in the present case there appeared or seemed to me some difference, etc. I soon found the advantage of this change in my manners. It would be the advantage, one of which is that people listen to him and he would win more arguments. And the only thing that he says after humility, instead of having a sentence describing it, he says, imitate Jesus and Socrates. You know, it's not bad. And of course, especially with regard to Socrates, we can argue all day whether he was humble. Right? Jesus, I leave to your imagination. I'm drawing. I'll try to wrap it up as best as I can. He understands that human nature is full of vanity and pride. That self-knowledge is necessary in a Republican regime, and that self-knowledge demands self-correction. Self-correction. This is a regime of equality and liberty. You're not going to be corrected by your betters. There are no betters. You are your own better. And if you don't take that opportunity to make yourself better, then you are like the 9 out of the 10. When he talks about these important things, he does it by storytelling, indirection, does it playfully. He really doesn't like disputation. He didn't like it in his personal life either. He never gave speeches, by the way. He never gave public addresses. He only talked to people individually or in small groups, like at the Constitutional Convention. And most of the time, he was silent. And he wrote. So private conversation and the written word were the most playful and the most indirect way of talking about these important things. He's very interested and successfully in his own mind, I think, both in his good work, what he accomplished. He wants to connect self-interest and self-respect. And he does that by encouraging others to work on others' behalf, what Tocqueville comes to call voluntary associations. This is, of course, one of the things that you Americans are great at. And you're the only ones who actually do this with any kind of seriousness. Voluntary associations for everything, bowling leagues, and, the Presbyterian Club of Ohio, and so forth. I'm not a member of that. Which reminds me, he once objected to a preacher, and he stopped going to the church because he discovered, he was a Presbyterian preacher. He discovered that, as he put it, the preacher was trying to make Presbyterians out of everybody instead of Americans. Human beings are moved by self-interest. This is not rocket science. This is modernity. The Americans invented this and rightly understand it. But he understands also that that self-interest has to be moderated and to some extent, as well as to some extent, accommodated. If you don't allow self-interest and you don't moderate it through the civic organizations and so forth, he thinks that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not possible. To be blunt about it, to be more blunt about it, he says this over and over again. Happiness is not possible if you don't do this right. You will actually be unhappy. The purpose of everything that he does is both freedom and happiness. They're the same thing, and they're teleologically understood in his case. That's the purpose of life. So he does encourage the pursuit of private advantage, but in moderation. And he always reminds the reader that the purpose of it all, including wealth creation, is happiness. And wealth creation is never an end in itself. He's very clear on that. And if some lefties misunderstanding that, that's their problem and not Franklin's. Wealth is a means to all good things. If there is no wealth creation, there are no schools, meaning no leisure, there are no hospitals, there are no churches, so forth. But wealth creation for itself, of course, is a vice. But because of this, the need for wealth creation and its connection to happiness, habits of industry and responsibility and civility are necessary. That in these articulations, in his writings, that he hides some deep problems. One author says that he wears masks. He doesn't reveal exactly what he thinks at all times, as it were in a Socratic way, if I may say. It's true enough. Because he's aware of the fact that in writing, it's different than in conversation. Anybody can read him, even people who are not prepared to know. So he's aware of that. He wants to somehow, and he explains this in his own way, I think we've touched on, he wants to make self-control among Republican citizens attractive by enlisting good works on behalf of fellow citizens and other human beings be put in the service of vanity. You will be praised for your good works. Franklin gives self-government the dignity, of course, it never had before. And he gives self-determination a dignity that certainly it never had before. Self-determination in a personal sense, not in the regime sense. Citizens, he understands, have to be habituated in the ways of respectability, because we're all equal, and that doesn't mean that we're low. Paraphrase Lincoln on that, Franklin is in accord with this. He understands that in this regime of equality, we ourselves have the opportunity to rise to equality. That equality is not a lowering, but a rising. And that is what is called respectability in his eyes. He puts it in a nice way, but I like this phrase. He said, this kind of regime demands a decent plainness, simplicity, plainness, and manly freedom. Two quick things and I'll end. Back to the Constitutional Convention. Where am I? He did three things at the Constitutional Convention. The two big ones were the motion for prayer. Right, you've heard of this. And this was in June of '87. And I'll just read one paragraph out of a sort of three-paragraph motion that he puts forward. He says, this is in June 28, 1787. In this situation, there's an impasse at the convention. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark. Now listen to the felicity of his word, the style. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? This is the deist calling for prayer. In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of superintending providence in our favor. To that kind of providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need its assistance? I have lived, sir, for a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God, who governs in the affairs of men, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? His motion was defeated. And the last thing worth mentioning, on the last day of the convention, September 17th, his speech at the conclusion of the deliberations, and I'll read a third of it. Less than a third, just to give you a flavor. He is calling for unanimity. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults. If they are such, that again, in these sentiments, in these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such. Because I think a general government necessary for us, and there's no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered, and I believe further that this is likely to be well administered by a course of years and can only end in despotism as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt, too, whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly, can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does, and I think it will astonish our enemies, who are waiting with confidence to hear that our counsels are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. And then he calls for a unanimous vote, which of course he gets. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Happy Constitution. Comments? Simplistic and thoughtless attacks from the faculty? Please.
Thank you for speaking, Dr. Schramm. I think we
My
all
pleasure.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
I was wondering, I was thinking about Aristotle's virtues and how one of them, more crowded than I thought, and how one of them is magnanimity, and I'm wondering how Ben Franklin would respond, because he claims humility to be one of his own.
I think that's a great question, and on the face of it, what you'd have to say is something like what Jesus would, rather than Socrates with regard to it. In other words, humility is a greater virtue than magnanimity because it demands less self-knowledge and therefore less possibility of vanity. Having said that, I'm not so sure. If magnanimity has something to, it's great souledness, is what the word megalosoukia, has something to do with your own knowledge of yourself and your own virtues, especially the great virtues that you yourself encompass. And if those virtues are indeed great, then you will be pushed into situations where you will act as humbly as possible, depending on the circumstances and who you be with. So the problem with magnanimity is that, in a certain respect, it's not visible by we common folk, because it looks like us. I once knew a professor who, every time, and I went with him a couple of times for odd reasons, took his car into a mechanic. He would talk to that mechanic in an arrogant, vainglorious tone. He wanted to know the mechanic, and he was one smart son of a bitch and could use big words. And he claimed to be a Christian. That was interesting to me. It was deeply offensive, I thought, and so did the mechanic. Now, these are big questions and merit serious consideration, which I'm not doing. I'm just pointing to a couple of things. Franklin wants the virtues to be useful. If they're not useful, they're not virtues. And they're useful for individual human beings and their well-being, spiritual, soul well-being, politic. Otherwise, they're nothing. Now, you say, that's kind of a strange thing, but when you think about it a lot, which we sort of do, but only parenthetically, right, in our little Republics classroom discussion and so on, that gets to be a very interesting problem. The thing that Franklin does, which Aristotle, I think, doesn't do, is that he says Franklin's virtues are harder, oddly. Why? Well, because he claims that they're dependent, that your own virtues are dependent entirely on you and on nobody else. It's nothing to do with your circumstances or background or wealth or whether your mother was, this way or that, or your father was this way or that. Aristotle is not that clear on that. He thinks there's a necessary condition of certain habits without which you can't have virtues and so on. Franklin says you have to make your own habits. If you don't have them, what she claims, of course, he did. Right? And he doesn't do that, I think, in my opinion, actually, I don't think he does that, arrogantly. And he thinks anybody can do it. He's very clear on it. This is the democratic philosopher of the common man. I mean, he's talking to you and me. He's talking to himself. He really had nothing. He came out of Boston, with a tough sort of puritanical background and so forth, and couldn't make a go of it there. Somehow it was restrictive in many ways and so forth, and he comes down to Philadelphia and starts working and laboring and does very well in print shops. He was a printer, and a printer in those days, it sounds kind of odd to us maybe, but printer it was like a blogger. You know what I mean? A printer was everything. And he started putting out publications for Richard's Almanac and so forth. Remarkable stuff, which he intended for those people who read nothing else to read Poor Richard. And it was full of advice and wit and so forth and so on, again, with all these issues of virtues in mind and self-government. Does that make any sense? Am I saying it clearly enough? Great stuff to study. And then, by the way, I don't think that much good has been written on Franklin. So some of you might take interest in these things. There's plenty of work to do here, really. And it's delightful stuff. He's a great guy. He's really a wonderful human being. I mean, no one denies that, except John Adams. And he was offended because he was vain. John Adams walked into a room, if there are 100 people in the room, he'd have 120 enemies in 5 minutes. Probably no guys like that, right? And Franklin did exactly the opposite. There was someone else whose hand was up. Please.
What do you think that Franklin would have to say about today's modern politics?
About?
Modern politics today.
I think that, he'd probably say what you and I as rational people say, that it's lowering, not raising, that it's petty and vain. But then, he probably said that about politics in the 1780s too. In fact, he did. But again, not that forcefully, because he actually tried not to be dogmatic in his presentation of his opinions, such as they were. And again, it's not that because he was a squish in some way. He actually was very clear on this stuff. It's really a wonderful read, and it's refreshing somehow, if I may put it that way, even in my old age. I mean, I haven't read Franklin in 35 years until about 9 months ago. It just, you just don't read something all the time. And I've forgotten. I mean, I've always been a hero of mine. I sort of forget why. Right? When you come to my place, you've seen me, he's above, the piano, next to naked women and Hungarian hussars and stuff. He's a tremendous character. I mean, he really thinks about how you people, it's one thing to have the Constitution as you and I understand that. It's another thing to have a way of life that both is able to create that Constitution, take advantage of it, and to continue it, perpetuate it. And it's that way of life that he is focused on. Now he also, obviously he's very clear on this. Human nature is this way rather than that way, and definitionally it's unchanging. So there's really no difference in politics in the beginning of the Republic and politics now. Except from their point of view, more was at stake. Because from our point of view, again, speaking loosely about both my political friends and enemies, I mean, who knows what's at stake? Do they think they know what's at stake? I don't think they do. I don't think, one of the advantages, if you're interested in going into politics over your life, which is about to start, there's a lot of running room there. And if you're interested in politics but don't want to participate in a technical way, there's even more running room. You can become the teacher of politicians, the way Franklin was. You think and write about these things in such a way that you're not didactic and heuristic, that you're actually just, pulling them towards your thoughts rather than, attacking them like a Baptist preacher would for their sins. Nobody makes friends that way, Franklin says. Nobody makes friends that way, and whatever citizens are in a republic, they're akin to friends. Any questions from the foreigner? Florida? Next time you come up, you bring your passport.
How did Franklin seek to, or did he seek to reconcile kind of what we kind of know him for today, his promiscuity, with his virtue or with Christian virtue? Did he try to do that?
He didn't try to do it with Christian virtue, and he wasn't that promiscuous, the truth of the matter. Well, what he was is extremely charming, and I mean, he really was. I mean, it's ridiculous. Really, these are the good stories that I didn't want to tell. So he walks into a drawing room in Paris, and by then he's famous. Like 76, and so he's there for a couple of years with Adams, drawing a treaty and so forth. And it's film should be made of it because he was a rock star. He was actually what you guys call a rock star. That's what he was. I mean, really, no, he really was. It's ridiculous. And paintings were made of him and distributed and printed, and coins were stamped of his image, and it's ridiculous. And he participated. He liked that. He said, it's fun. And, there's no reason not to like that. So you couldn't. So anyway, his so-called promiscuity is like, Grant's drinking problem. I'm not sure he had one. Now Adams, listen to me, from John Adams and Abigail, who were, needless to say, extremely interesting, if not lovable people. They certainly loved one another. It's one of the great love affairs, of course, of all time. Two Yankee tough guys in love. Really? John Adams thought the worst of him. And so when Franklin was charming in a room filled with aristocratic men and women, Adams, of course, started making accusations left and right. Most of it was not true. He had love affairs. There's no question about that, and they were serious. But we're talking about a man who's in his 80s, and there's a certain point at which I kind of hesitate to go on with this, but God bless him. Really? But he wasn't as promiscuous as we think. That he loved ladies. Oh, he writes on that. I didn't bring it. I couldn't. Chairman of the board is here. Does that make any sense? That's. But again, there are varied opinions on that. He had some great love affairs that he wouldn't quit on. Very interesting. Yes, please.
Do you think, given if Franklin would be a younger age, he could have been a good executive leader, such as Washington?
That's a very interesting question. My instinct says no, and he, I think, would say no. And I think because his whole disposition, intellectually and even morally, is opposed to that. In other words, that's hard for him to do. He's a thinker. He's kind of our Socrates in a certain way. Did he make executive decisions as you and I sort of? Absolutely. With regard to the Brits and the French and so forth, yes, absolutely. And so he was in positions like that. He was also in lower level positions, county government and things like that. But when he was a diplomat, what he did with the French is really, according to what I read, was really quite remarkable. And so he had to make decisions left and right. And that means not just make decisions, but put people in certain situations so they would be inclined to make the decisions that the Americans wanted the French to make. Adams didn't get that at all. And that's really an interesting study, by the way. Because Adams just couldn't seduce anyone. Intellectually, Franklin could.
One more question.
If any. Yes, please.
Why do you believe Franklin's request for prayer at the beginning of the convention was denied, even though in his request he makes mention that every day they prayed for God's assistance throughout the war?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I think there was a way in which these guys were kind of embarrassed by it. That there they were, you know, the smartest guys on the continent, and they kind of knew that, and they had to figure things out, and if they couldn't do it themselves, you know, they should be damned. There's kind of manly pride involved. On the other hand, there's Ben Franklin, who is not exactly your, you know, evangelical Christian. Now, he's not, he claimed at one point early in his life that he was an atheist. And he stopped believing that, by the way, because the effect of his atheism on his friends was is they became promiscuous jerks, sort of moral relativists and such. And he said, oh my God, you know, so even if I think I'm an atheist, I'm not going to say that because it has this effect. You see what I mean? So I don't really know the answer to that, but you know, the founders had this, as you know, generically a very interesting and complex relationship with Providence, let's just say. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.